Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Welcome back to the Pub and Porch Applied Stoicism podcast. I am your host, Adam, with my co-host, Mick Mulroy here. Today, we're going to jump right into it and talk about a topic that I think, works well with some of our other topics as of late, including things like political violence, for example. And the topic today is about protest and protesting and a Stoic's view on those things. So let's open today by giving ourselves a bit of a definition of that. So dictionary.com would label protest as a noun, an expression or declaration of objection, disapproval, or dissent, often in opposition to something a person is powerless to prevent or avoid. For example, a protest against increased taxation. And protest can be a verb. You can give protest. You can make a protest, say a protest, for example. And I think, for me, looking at this word and this description, right, I mean, Stoics are one of those groups that have been known to protest much throughout history. So, it's definitely something that's core to the story of Stoicism, is what I would say. And I think, with things that have been happening recently, I think it's a good place for us to start when we talk about what we can do as Stoics if we see the world around us maybe not shaping up the way we like it to be. So, but Mick, what's your take on protest as a first inroad into this conversation?
Well, first of all, I think that was a very good intro. I mean, if you think about opposition, the Stoic opposition throughout the Roman Empire, it was core to what Stoics viewed themselves as, right? So, and those were essentially protests, many of them done by senators whose only means to protest was speech and action, right? They didn't have armies. So, and it was very much at their own peril. So the idea to start with, the idea that Stoicism is some kind of passivity or like emotional indifference is just not accurate. I mean, I know we're going to talk about the misconception of Stoicism and Stoics quite often. And that I think is one of the big ones, because I think Stoicism, with its focus on justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance, or what I prefer to call self-discipline, is not only a model for a moral structure of protesting injustice, right, but also doing so in a way that's tempered, that shows respect for the law and understands that part of what you're trying to do is to convince people that you're correct morally, and you can't do that by acting immoral.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it demands, essentially, if you take all of the cardinal virtues, it demands one, action, I would say, in the face of injustice. And some of the folks I wanted to highlight today, of course, known to Americans, but people worldwide, Martin Luther King.
Mm-hmm.
But then, in typical Mick Mulroy fashion, I wanted to bring in some Irish versions of Martin Luther King. But they all used, I think, the moral high ground to their benefit. So not just to be a good person, right, which is important, but also because it is a form of strength, not weakness.
Right.
To be able to walk across a bridge in Alabama for civil rights, with your head held high, not with clubs, not with rocks. Those are the things, I think, when you look at the protests today, and there's obviously many, from Minnesota and Minneapolis to Iran right now. And right after this, I'll be talking about the substantial protests in Iran, 31 provinces. And those people who are fighting, in the case of the Iranians, they're fighting for women's rights. If you remember Amini, the Kurdish Iranian girl that was killed basically for not wearing her head gear correctly, to the rights of ethnic groups in
Yeah.
Iran, which are treated very poorly in many ways, to just the economic circumstances where people in Iran can't feed their family. So, but
Hmm.
they aren't armed, and they in the media it says right now there's about 3,500 killed. I think that's probably around 15,000 to be frank. We simply don't know. But the point of it isn't to talk specifically about the issues of Iran. It is that it shows incredible courage, not only to protest where you know the consequences could easily be lethal. And that's what's
Yeah.
happening in Iran right now. And it's something to highlight because it really shows what I'm talking about. They have the moral high ground and they're not using force right now. And I'm not, I mean, you know, my background for those who listen to us, I'm not against the use of force, right? Where it's justified. But when it
Sure.
comes to protest, particularly in a democracy, I am against force either
Yes.
way, right? So you should be able to say what you have to say in a
Hmm.
in a civil way, and not use violence, right?
Right.
So one of the things I was going to highlight about Dr. King was in 1963. So I went to law school in Birmingham, Alabama. So a lot of what we learned about in constitutional law was down the street. So I used to actually go to places after we read about it in a case, um, you know. And so at one time, if you think about Birmingham in 1963, it used to be called Bombingham, right? There's so many bombs being
Yeah.
set off by white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan, et cetera, about the civil rights movement and the demand of African Americans and especially the South to have equal rights. And
Yeah.
this is a time when this guy named Bull Connor was the sheriff of Birmingham. He used to use fire hoses that were so strong they would take bark off of trees, right? Uh,
Right.
he used to use dogs that were, you know, better set for the battlefield
Yeah.
than certainly on the streets of the United States. And there was a time when Dr. King realized that a lot of young men that were at these protests had had enough, right? They'd had enough of seeing their, sisters mowed down by cannons, tear gas, dogs suck on their younger brother, stuff like that. And they were about to go to force. They were
Yeah.
about to start bringing. You see bottles started showing up at protests. You see rocks kind of stacked strategically, if you will.
Yeah.
And he went out there and he gave a speech specifically about the threats that he and his family had endured early on.
Hmm.
Where he'd get phone calls nonstop. He'd have like burning effigies outside of his house, and he really explained it in a way that I'm trying to explain. I'm sure it's not near as coherent or inspiring as his, but that you literally are strong by showing that you can face this kind of, uh, you know, evil, if you will,
Yeah.
with strong determination, but not the same violence that they're giving toward you. And I
Right.
had a quote from Seneca that I think we're somewhat familiar with, but anger is not, if not restraint, is frequently more hurtful to us than the injury that provokes it. So
Yes.
that I think, and it's for your cause, whatever that cause is. Obviously, it should be just, but whatever it is better off if you are the ones that show the restraint.
Right.
Even in the case of some things that are happening in the United States, the police aren't the ones showing the restraint. They obviously should, but you can't if you want to maintain your um, moral high ground. Then
Hmm.
that is absolutely it's tough. It's tough. I mean, we all have
Sure.
tempers, and like
Yeah.
I pointed out, however you fall on the current situation in Minneapolis, what I've asked my
Yeah.
friends who, might view it politically more than just watching it. What if that was your hometown? What
Yeah.
if that was your wife? What if that was your sister? Right. So
Yeah.
I'd also point out that um, you have to view things objectively and not
Yes.
through your own lens. But anyway, I'll stop
Yeah,
there.
no, for sure. Absolutely. And I think, something that I think we're kind of trending towards in this conversation is, political violence is not okay. Protest, though, is a form of standing up for your beliefs that I wouldn't say it's an alternative political violence because I don't see them as equivalent. But I would say that protest is something that you can do now. You can do that protest now. You can sign that petition. You can have that attendance at a rally for something. I mean, I've done many of those here, right? And I think that's a key. That's a key thing here. It's you're not protesting because that's the moral high ground. You're protesting because in a democracy, that's how that works, right?
Hmm.
Democracies should be free of the political violence that we've had in the past. A democracy should be, as a people, demos, right? It
Hmm.
should be rhetorical in the sense of you're talking back and forth with everyone, and that's what protest is in many cases, right? Is you're saying, well, I protest this, right? I disagree with this. And I think that's something that we have to kind of remember, right? It's tough though, I would say, and you kind of were highlighting that it can be really tough because protest is also, in many ways, protest is a slower path to change, but at the same time, um, rapid change is also not great. So, I think protest as a viable, I hate to say alternative, but as a viable choice to make when wanting to change something, I think that's real. And it's built into our democracies. Your and mine, pretty much every democracy has the right to freedom of assembly, right? To be able to do those sorts of things, right? And there's a reason for that because by allowing that, it allow for everybody. By allowing for that, I think it allows us to have this political rhetoric, which includes complete disagreement with something that doesn't include that violent side of it. And I think that's really an important thing to kind of keep in mind as this goes forward. There's always so many other things you can do, right?
Hmm.
Like we said, like even in many ways, right? Just simply putting a sign on your lawn is a form of protest, right? But I'd rather someone put a sign on their lawn than throw a bottle, you know,
Yeah,
bring a club to a peaceful thing. So, but I think for me as well, protest is one of those things that's a duty bound thing as a Stoic. There was an interesting as I was doing some research on this, right? And every once in a while you want to know what the social media is telling you, and people were sort of like, do I? Someone was saying something like, "Do I protest or do I remain Stoic?" And I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting concept, right?" And in reality, first off, that's a misappropriation of the word stoic because
yeah,
that's the
yeah.
lowercase s one, as I always call it,
That's
and
the
we've talked about this
misperception
before.
I started with. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. But at the same time, I think it's a valid thing to talk about because they'll be like, well, Stoics. Some people will look at Stoicism in the way it's described as you are only hurt by something if you decide to be, right? You are only hurt by something if you say that it is hurting you. And so they're like, well, this doesn't bother me, so it's fine. I'm not going to do anything about it. But you know, Stoicism is an action oriented philosophy. Oddly enough, for many people to kind of hear that, they're like, oh, really? You're like, yeah, it is. Stoicism is an action oriented philosophy in the sense of you must do what's right. I keep going back to this quote from Marcus Aurelius. It's so simple, right? If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it, or whatever order that is in.
But I think that's right.
I think that's right, but it is a duty bound thing for us, right? Like if it is not right, you must do something, and not only do we have historical examples of this, right, of Stoics standing up and saying like we oppose this, but we also it's clearly part of our philosophy of like we are not a do nothing group, right? We are not an idle group. We do stand up and protest those things, and I think it's important to say that as of the verb protest, not the noun, but the verb
Right.
of you know because it is not a bad thing, and I don't think any rhetoric of any kind, whether it's in the workplace, in the family, in the society, there should never be a situation where you are unable to say I disagree, right?
I agree.
Well, I kind of thought that might happen. No, but it is one of those things, I think, right, where we have to uphold that more than anything, right? And but I think it also comes with those tenets that we've kind of talked about, right? You have to focus on why you are, like, is it based on reason? Are you following virtue? Are you looking for arete, right? In these things, is the thing you're protesting taking away from that, right? And then you also have to control your response. You have to control how you do those things, right? Because I think in many ways you and I are talking about peaceful protests, right? Because we've already
Well, we're
spoken about political
advocating for,
violence.
yeah, we're
Yes, we're
advocating for
advocating
peaceful
for that's a
protest.
great
Yeah.
way to put that.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing here, right? So, if you're doing that protest and controlling your response and making sure that you're handling it, with temperance, with wisdom. I think, that's a really important thing. But we should not be sitting down and being idle on these things. I think people think that's how Stoicism is, and it's really not.
No.
I've been to I think my last protests here. I went to a large union protest here a little while ago, but I've protested against stuff for the government. I protest against stuff for our healthcare system here in Ontario, where I live. All of those things, and it doesn't feel like nothing. It doesn't feel like nothing when you're out there, right? You're still getting you're still getting the message out, and I think that's really important. And I said the workplace before, but I mean, you know, not saying anything is complacency, right? So if you disagree with the way something's going, and when in my world of working in manned space flight safety, if you disagree, right, that can be really bad if you don't say it, because you're not doing the duty bound thing you are to make sure that we do the right thing. And there are points in history of the space program where people didn't speak up, and really bad things happened. And I think it's important to kind of talk about this as well. To say the focal point for this conversation obviously surrounds things happening in the current event of the political sphere, but I think protests can happen in many ways in our lives, and we should be able to talk about it. So, but anyways, that's what it is.
Yeah. And, two more points, or two additional points. One, obviously, people are going to go to protests that are of interest to them, right? I mean, something that affects you.
Hmm.
But I would also say that in the idea that Stoics has an obligation to seek justice when there is
Hmm.
injustice, which means protest.
Yeah.
Um, you also do when it's not necessarily about you, right?
Hmm.
So if you believe in the right to free speech, that means you agree in everybody's right to free speech. If it's just
Yeah.
about your speech, then that's really not free speech. That's your speech.
Right.
So there's often things that happen that are unjust to certain groups or people. If and you might not be part of those groups,
Yeah.
but I think
Yeah.
a true Stoic protester or opposition to injustice would include them, right? So that's one point. The other, and I've been in, like, they train for whatever reason Marines in riot control. What's a protest gone wrong, so to
Oh
speak.
yeah.
So they put us in the scenario where we're an actual riot. It's not real, right?
Right.
Um, but even in that fake scenario, it turns tribal really quick,
Hmm.
like really quick,
Yeah.
to the point where it's, I don't even know if people would remember, because we obviously, it was a fake protest. It was training. Like, there wasn't even a
Right.
real issue, right?
Yeah.
Yet
Yeah.
it immediately broke down as your side, their side, kill them, not kill them, but
Sure.
in a very primitive way, and goes beyond what the whole point is. Like, if you
Yeah.
look at January
Yeah.
6th and the assault on the U.S. Capitol, if you look at the videos from that, if you can stand it, um, it's super primal, right? So you also got to keep in mind. So if we launch all these people, whoever's listening to us, out to go protest, keep that in mind. I mean, it's a cautionary tale. You got to be willing to walk away when the violence supersedes the whole point of being there, especially if it's on your side.
Yeah.
And the other guy I was going to reference, like Dart King, somebody who's considered the Irish Martin Luther King, Daniel O'Connell. Um, he was a champion for the rights of Irish Catholics in Ireland, believe it or not, who were clearly second class citizens.
Hmm.
And he was a very big advocate, cited by Gandhi as one of the inspirations, early 1800s, um,
Yeah.
for fighting for freedom. And he'd have what these called monster meetings. I think it was a Gaelic term for it,
Hmm.
because hundreds of thousands of people would show up. Think about
Right.
that. Back in a day when they probably didn't even have a microphone, right? Hundreds of thousands of people here would show up to his. And then he had one that was so big that the British started sending troops into Ireland.
Hmm.
And then he realized what was going to happen. You know, he realized this was going to turn into a bloodbath because people were planning to use what he termed a peaceful rally into one that would actually trigger an uprising,
Yeah.
right? So you throw a brick at a soldier, they shoot you, then
Hmm.
you have some basically sacrificial lambs, but it causes a violent uprising, which of
Yeah.
course happens in history. And I mean, U.S. wouldn't be here if we wouldn't fight for it. So again, I'm not saying that sometimes it doesn't just come down to that,
Right.
but he realized that that would take away the moral high ground of what he was trying to do and canceled
Yeah.
it. Right. So got a
Yeah.
lot of grief, people saying he's a coward. But essentially, it wasn't about him. It was about the fact that he knew a bunch of young men were going to get slaughtered because,
Yeah.
um, and, eventually, obviously, Catholics got their complete emancipation and equality. And,
Hmm.
Ireland was free in the 1900s. But the point being is he was another model to look at
Yeah.
as how one can go about. Uh, if you have a just cause, keep it just is another way to put it,
Yeah.
and don't stoop to your enemies. And then another quote we all know, Epictetus: "When you are offended by any man's fault, turn to yourself and study your own failings." Right. So
Yeah.
don't, which is another way of really saying, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy.
Right.
So I would say that those are guiding principles for the Stoic opposition. If
Absolutely.
it's injustice for anybody, it's injustice for you,
Yeah.
but do it in a way that you maintain your moral high ground and
Yeah.
be as reflective upon yourself as you would other people.
Absolutely. And I think that leads into something that we should talk about in this dialogue, which is, the fact that you may protest one thing and somebody else may protest something else, right? Like it's happening a lot today where you're having protests and counter protests, right? And they're
Yeah,
taking place coincidentally and they sometimes they cross over physically, literally in the same space, and that can sometimes go wrong. And I think, this is one of those interesting points where, um, and I think we've talked about this maybe, but I usually try to reflect on this quote from, I believe it's Rousseau, where he says, I may not like a thing that you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Right.
yes,
And I think that's a
exactly.
really important thing that we should talk about here because as, as much as a Stoic, right? Cato, for example, let's take Cato as a great example of protest. Cato he stood up and offered his protest many times in his life, well before the civil war of Rome with Caesar. He stood up and said, yeah, I disagree with this, I disagree with that, but there was still a rhetoric there, right? Like even while he was calling out Caesar's war crimes in Gaul and all of these other horrible things, I think we talked about that last week or something like that. But when those things happen, right, Cato's still understanding that this is a two-sided conversation, right? He's understanding
Hmm.
that. So, I think it's interesting when people protest and then they get offended by other people protesting maybe the opposite or something like
Right.
that. Or just touch my mic. And that's one of those interesting things where I'm kind of like, yeah, but that has to be fine. I hate to say it that way because it sounds so absolute, but that really has to be okay. You cannot preserve freedom of speech and freedom of assembly if it disregards freedom of assembly for some other people who disagree with you. That's not
Exactly.
okay, right?
Exactly.
And I think this is a really important thing to take into account. This is where justice is a big part of these things that we talk about. because one of the things about justice, about benevolence and magnanimity, is there's an equivalence or an equality to that you have to impart upon others, not just for yourself. You can't say, well, I'm being really nice to you, I'm protesting for you. And you might talk to someone and they go, well, I disagree with your protest. and
Hmm.
then and then there's a weird kind of dialogue there. But in reality, justice means you have to uphold that for other people as well. I'll quote Ricky Gervais, who says stuff like, you have every right to be, you have every right to say what you want, or, so does everybody else. And you have every right to be pissed off, but you're not allowed to, tell someone else they're not allowed to piss you off, right? They're not allowed to offend
Hmm.
you. That's just weird. Like, how selfish would that be to go through life thinking you should never be offended, right? That's ridiculous. And I think that kind of goes with the thread here, right? As Stoics, we understand that these things are dialogues, and the I think it's the Epictetus quote that you had, which says you have to look into yourself as well, right? You end up in this circumstance where, um, you end up in this circumstance where you have to take into account those viewpoints and look again at yourself, right? Like, it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy, when you look at certain protests where you're like, the counter protest, like my protest is freedom for people, and the counter protest is no freedom for people. There's probably some moral discussion
Hmm.
there where you're like, I don't know that the other side has a lot to stand on. But there
Yeah.
are other things about like, healthcare dismantlement protests. I've been here, like, for that happening in places like Ontario, where they try to privatize healthcare all the time, right? That's one of those things where, you can have a dialogue, and you can say, like, I can say all healthcare should be public, right? And then people will say, or I think in the States they use the term single payer, right?
Hmm.
And then those people who want to privatize, they come in and say, well, what about this and what about that? And you kind of go, okay, well, some of that stuff maybe we could talk about, right? But
Hmm.
you can't just have your viewpoint and then expect that it's always right. That's crazy talk, really, for me. And
You
I
know,
feel like I don't want to lose the thread here, but I think, let's going back to it. It's just like, you know, like, it's funny. I would, if someone wanted to if someone wanted to shut down protests for things that I disagree with, I would protest against them trying to shut down that protest that I disagree with. It sounds crazy, but
sure. No, it
I
isn't.
think you
That's
have to do
that's
that.
that's what means you actually believe in the freedom that you say you do, right?
Yeah.
It's freedom
Yeah.
of speech for everybody, and like you already quoted Rousseau. One trick that I kind of picked up, my dad used to do it. Um, I don't know if it was purposeful, but and then they did it in a class I was in law school. Um, if you put a group of people in a circle and you throw out topics and you have people debate them, abortion, for example, um, it can get pretty heated. I'm not just picking on abortion, but topics that tend to
Yeah.
elicit
Yeah. Ones that come with a
emotional
little bit of a higher
responses.
volume, right? Yeah.
Right, right. And then the professor made us, when you were paired off, like a debate, that's what it was in law school, right? So that's what you do.
Hmm.
If you were required to repeat the other person's position back to them before you made yours, it significantly tamped down the emotional aspect of it.
Right.
It didn't eliminate it, but it was almost a forcing function so that you didn't just dismiss what the other person was saying
Right.
and just waiting your turn to launch, right? You're not
Right.
listening. You're just waiting your turn to say what you were going to say, regardless of what that person said. I think that's very helpful,
Yeah.
even in interpersonal relationships.
Oh,
If
yeah.
somebody says, I think you're a jerk because you did this the other day, if instead of saying, I'm not a jerk, you're a jerk, blah, 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 saying, okay, so you perceived what I said as this, and it made you feel like I was being demeaning or whatever.
Yeah.
You explain their position to them so that you understand it. And at
Yeah.
least for me,
Yeah.
uh, it helps. And in the context of what we're talking about, you should be able to do that if it's a protest where you have opposing sides. Like,
Yes.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, you should be, if nobody's talking, then nobody's talking. Then you just hold your sign or what have you. But
Sure.
if it is an actual dialogue, if you try that,
Yeah.
it tends to calm down. Now, the other situation you have a lot in the United States and other places is there there isn't necessarily an opposition. There's just a policeman or woman standing there. And then
Hmm.
all of a sudden they become your opposition, even though they're
Right.
not really your opposition. They're just trying to keep the peace. So I
Hmm.
would also put a plug out there to keep that in mind. Like
Yeah.
cussing and spitting and stuff at law enforcement is unacceptable. And it is completely counterproductive to your cause.
Yeah.
And you've turned them, in some cases, I get it. Sometimes they're over uh, aggressive. But in a
Hmm.
case where they're just there to keep the peace,
Yeah.
they're not your punching bag.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and they're not there to debate your cause, right? They might agree
Right.
with your cause, right?
Yeah.
But I'd also keep that in mind because there's a very practical issue when it comes to protests nowadays.
Yes.
Um, so,
Absolutely. It
yeah,
escalates
that's
too
something
much,
to keep
and
in mind.
it is something to keep in mind, and it's something that I think people can kind of forget about, right? I heard a great it might have been a meme or something like that, but it was something like someone asked me a question one time in a conversation that I think came out of this meme or whatever, where someone was like, "So are you listening to understand or are you listening to respond?"
Yeah.
And that I think that's something that we can take into all of this. Like we talk about protests, and again, it sounds like people with signs, like storming a building or something. That's not really what we're talking about all the time, because protest is so many things, about disagreements and things, right? But if you're in that circumstance at work and you get that email that you feel is nasty, and then you're typing it out, and it's you're literally rattling the keyboard off of the table, maybe you need to take a step back and do that thing that you
Yes.
were asking about. What is their real position here, right? Are they attacking me? Am I harmed by this? What does my next step need to be, right? Because ultimately that's I think more powerful than anything, right? I have so many times in really big debates and meetings just stepped up and said, look, like, what are we really talking about here? Like, let's go back to this objectively speaking, right? Like, everybody has a position, and as human beings, we're allowed our positions. I don't want to take away from that, but I do want to say, like, I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what is this dialogue that you're having? Because I think going back to the whole thing of, like, if you're allowed to protest, then they're allowed to protest, right? And at the same
Yes.
time, in this circumstance, if you're allowed to have a point, they're allowed to have a point too, right? And there could be a middle ground between you. That's where the actual truth lies. And so you have to ask yourself that, right? Am I listening to understand, or am I listening to respond? Am I listening to interject? Because if you're waiting to interject, that's a big thing. And so, at times in relationships with friends or family or whatnot, I have said, like, so what are you looking for here? Do you want me to listen? Do you want me to give you a solution? Like, what is that, right? And that's I think listening more than anything, because also sometimes people protest just because they're protesting. They're just
Yeah, it's
angry.
professional protests. They just send them
Yeah,
out there, pay them, and they go out and those
right.
are the ones that are usually violent, right? Because
Yeah,
they don't necessarily even agree with what they're protesting. So what is the point, right? I
yeah.
mean, they can hold up a sign and stuff, but
Sure, but at the
yeah,
I think it's that thing though where you do have to ask yourself, like, because in many ways I feel like protest should be a very first step in telling a group of people or a person or a movement or something that someone disagrees with you or someone doesn't think this is okay, right? And I would like to see that always turn into a dialogue. I probably am optimistic when I do that, but I cannot believe that protests always need to turn violent. I don't believe that that's a reality, right? I've been to so many protests that
oh,
were
yeah,
peaceful, and we barely saw a police officer. The only thing they did was direct us through traffic. Because yes, I have held up signs. I have gone to these things before, right? And
well,
I
your
think I
Canadians,
see it
your
as being,
protests are probably nicer than ours.
yeah, we protest. It's organized littering. That's what it is. So, but but no, I've done marches. I've done some long marches actually, where it's like middle of August in Ontario, because pretty sticky outside. And I think they walked us through Toronto. It was it's probably the equivalent of about 3 kilometers. So I don't know what that is, a mile and a half type of thing. So, like, it was not an easy day. But at the same time, I think what we're really talking about here is that you have to be able to see the protest and think about what they're going for. There have been protests that have turned violent before, right? That I think people just write it off as, well, those people are crazy. But when you really look at the core of it, most of them, they're trying to get some kind of message out there. And I don't think it's wrong for a Stoic to look at anybody's message and say, well, what are they trying to say? And make a decision about whether or not you disagree with it. And that's fine. So,
I remember.
but what's say?
I remember if you remember this famous, I think it was a Pulitzer Prize winning photo of an African American guy that was getting hit with a flag. You
Mm-hmm.
remember that? You remember that? It's
That sounds
very
familiar.
poignant.
Yeah.
He was
Yeah.
after that event. He was at the house of our neighbor in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And I remember my parents telling me about what had happened, and then years later, I saw the picture, and they were like, "Oh yeah, that's the guy." It was about racial justice, of course,
Right.
but that's a perfect example of when, even if your race isn't the one that's being oppressed, if you're not the one out there uh, putting your part to it to
Yeah.
correct the injustice, then in some ways you're just as much part as the oppression as the ones that are doing it.
Yeah.
Right? If your silence is statement,
Yeah.
right?
Silence is, what is the state? I can't remember. There was a guy I used to work with in the medical device world, and he used to say silence is not complacence. Silence is acceptance, I think is what he used to say in meetings.
Yeah,
And I actually felt that was weaponizing that type of term, frankly. But you're right. Silence is a statement in some way.
it
I
is.
think
If
you're
you
right.
if you're not willing to say, stick up for other people's rights, and you're really not for rights, you're just for yourself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Another thing that I would think that Stoicism really promotes when it comes to protests, under the idea of, you know, Zeno's Republic and seeing
Yeah.
out a society that was essentially um, democ- democratic
Hmm.
meritocracy, if you will. Stoics should promote democracies around the world.
Hmm.
You shouldn't just accept, well, I got it, so we're good. Whatever
Yeah.
you want to be, you want to be. And so
Yeah.
when you're looking at places like Iran, which in essence is fighting for individual human rights and
Hmm.
civil liberties, the rest of the world should be, in my opinion, supportive. If you're a Stoic or if you believe in democracy,
Yeah.
it's just like the individual right things. If it's something that for you, then it's about yourself. It's something individual right for somebody else, and it's truly about that right.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing, I think, when it comes to Iran. I'm not weighing in, at least not on this, on what the
Right.
U.S. should or shouldn't do, but the idea that the world should focus, the world should, uh, you know, make itself
Support.
known and
Yeah.
support, because we are in a situation right now where autocracies are becoming more and democracies are becoming less. Like that's
Yeah.
a big problem. Like that should be a cause. That should be a life cause for Stoics, I think,
Oh
right
yeah.
now.
I
Right.
believe.
So
I believe that
protests are,
too.
are very much tied to democracies, right?
Yes.
You should have an absolute right to peacefully protest in a democracy. If you don't, it is not a democracy, or at least not a full
Totally.
one. It's very
Totally.
limited if it is. Right.
Yeah.
In the freedom scale, the Freedom House has a scale, right? So it's not.
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
yeah. And if you can't just go out and peacefully protest without
Yeah.
getting your head cracked in, you're not you are sliding down the democratic scale toward the autocratic side of the house, and you should, I mean, to the point where you should insist they're allowed to, even if you disagree with them.
Yeah.
I think if you really truly believe in the idea of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this in some earlier podcasts, right? It can't be one sided. I mean, we were talking about it earlier in this podcast. You can't have it one way. Like you can't be the only one allowed to protest. You can't be the only one allowed to, democratically elect your leaders, and then other people, you know, take leaders away through military force or something like that. You can't be okay with it only because it's for you, right? This cosmopolis, this larger world that, Marcus and everybody else talks about in our philosophy. It's not just an idea. It's a reality, right? We are interconnected as people, right? Until everyone in the world is represented, you know, the way they want to be represented, then we are at some in some levels as human beings suffering, right? And I hate that sounds so dire, but I mean that's a reality, and I would hate to start looking at it through the rose-colored glasses because you and I live on a continent that's relatively peaceful. Great, but at the same time, it doesn't matter if other people in the globe are suffering. And so, to me, I think it's very important, just like you said, to support these things for a wider thing. And one last thing I want to make sure that I say from today as well, right? Protest is not polar. I don't think protest has to be polar. I don't think that sometimes you have two opposing views, right? But you think you always have to be polarized in this. You don't have to be Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, left wing, right wing. I think that's a really weird thing in my mind. I protest some stuff that's right wing and I protest some stuff that's left wing. I'll be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I
I'm
think
glad you brought
it's
that
okay
up.
to be in the middle.
I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, being, I think, truly intellectual or having wisdom is having the
Mm-hmm.
ability to change your mind, which means you
Yeah,
shouldn't have your positions dictated to you. Like you shouldn't look at
sure.
a party platform and say, I guess that's what I agree with because I'm in the party. Well, that's weak sauce, right?
Yeah.
And there is a trend, which I think is great, of young people not joining these political parties,
Yes.
being an independent.
Yeah.
I think to truly be wise, you have to be an independent. In other words, you have
Mm-hmm.
to take every issue as just that, its own
Yeah.
issue, and be
Yeah.
willing to, repeat the other side so that you actually say it out loud so you can understand what they're saying and not just wait your turn to argue. And then
Mm-hmm.
you decide on your own. Obviously, I'm not saying Stoicism promotes
Totally.
any one particular issue. I think sometimes it does, but that's up for you to decide. But what I'm saying is, why be spoon fed your beliefs? You
Yeah.
know, like, no, I think I believe this on this issue and that on that issue, and sometimes it's on the right, sometimes it's on the left or center or whatever. That I
Yes.
think is much more in line with the Stoic concept of wisdom. It's not just being smart and knowing a bunch of facts, right?
Yeah.
It is much more about your ability to change your mind and accept new
Mm-hmm.
facts to mean new results, and
Right.
that means political independence. In my
Yeah. And you
humble
may
opinion.
choose your idea of protest. You may protest on the other side in the future if you hear
Sure.
something out. So I
All
think
right,
that's a
my
good
friend.
place for us to wrap up
Yeah,
today. Yeah. So let's get ourselves wrapped up and on to the next one. But Mick, great conversation today. Thank you. And we'll hear everyone on the next one. But we'd love to hear from you in the comments or messages if you have your own points of view or protesting the protest. So thanks everyone for
that's
today.
right. Thank you for listening to the Pup and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pupandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pupandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pup and Porch out.